So we've had a look at learning styles, the different approaches, theories we can use, and we can use those as part of our own self-development, self-awareness, knowing our own learning style, but also we can think about it for the consideration of the impact on others and the organisation. Does the way we learn impact on others? Do we expect people to be the same as us? Do we expect them to know what our preferences are? Do they know what their best preferences are? Does it trigger our emotions, or do their emotions get triggered by it? Hopefully in that activity you've made some notes and they'll be useful for you when you do the unit assignment and start looking at different learning theories, learning styles and theories. So let's have a look at behavioural styles. So now let's have a look at behaviour styles. Normally categorised into four main categories: analytic, driver, amiable and expressive. We're going to look at this briefly and simply because it's just about identifying or categorising people, a bit like the learning styles, but this time onto a particular behavioural style that they show. And this could be used in looking at roles, tasks or interactions with others. We'll take an extremely simplified look at these four before we start looking at some theories which go into a bit more detail. There's characteristics for each of these styles, and they're portrayed in people's behaviours, and they won't necessarily display all of them because, or they may display more because there may be a mix. You may be analytic and show that you're expressive, and you could have a mixture of those two. But basically, analytical or analytic are people who display behaviours that like and have an ability to work with data, gathering information, reviewing stuff. They're generally suited to technical positions, probably in areas such as engineering, accounting, information technology. And people who exhibit this sort of behaviour, details and accuracy are really, really important, and they take great time in providing it. They can sometimes be seen as delaying, and sometimes they won't provide at all because it's got to be perfect for them. Drivers, people displaying this sort of behavioural style, as the name implies, are focused around a driving force and making sure they get things done. They're the sort of doers in the organisation. Very results orientated, motivated by achieving goals, and therefore drawn to performance management, sales roles, target driven sorts of stuff. Amiable, people displaying these sort of behaviours, are highly supportive and have a strong interest in sort of establishing and maintaining relationships. They're people. They make good employees in areas where relationships are key, such as human resources, social, medical services, customer services related, or personal management sort of situations. And then finally, expressive. These people are visionary people, big picture people. They tend to like things like strategy, marketing, something based around selling their ideas. They're like politicians. They like to sell a vision, influence people, and establish and use contacts to sort of build and make sure that everyone understands where they're going and sort of the big picture of things, and sort of they don't like to get involved in the minutiae. So very simplistic. You can see what the idea or the basis of behavioural styles is, and there's lots of theories been built on that. So we'll take a look at a couple of recognised theories. So the first sort of area we look at is social or style grids. Sort of a category, and predominantly we'll be focusing on David Merrill's people style grid. He took those four styles that we discussed earlier, he called them social styles rather than behavioural styles, and then he looked at two factors that he thought impacted on them. The first was assertiveness, and the next was responsiveness. By assertiveness, he was predominantly talking about what we do when we communicate with others, and responsiveness, he was talking about how we respond to requests or demands for others. And he looked at how they impacted on those four main styles, and come up with a grid. So let's have a look at what he identified across the scales of responsiveness and assertiveness and how they impacted on the four main styles. So Merrill's first factor that he said an impact was assertiveness. Sometimes it's also known in other sort of grids as dominance. In most social situations or our work situations, we need to get people to do things. We need to communicate with them. We want them to complete things, be engaged, be motivated, and they want to be managed and supported. So he said assertiveness was predominantly about communicating with others. And and we need to make requests to get people to do things. So we can either be highly assertive and sort of demand things, or we can make requests less assertively. We can ask or be quite passive. He said there were two ends to the scale: high assertive and low assertive. They've come up there, and that's high assertive is tells, and low assertive are categorized as asks. Highly assertive people are likely to tell, demand what they want, believing they have a right for it, and they may just expect it. They can be very assertive, tackle problems head on. They don't lack self-confidence, and they feel that they have a right to demand what they want. They think it's a dog-eat-dog world, and that the strongest will win and fight and get what they need, and if not, they'll just take it. And they're highly competitive people, where on the low assertiveness end, he said, these people would rather ask others than demand or tell people what they need. They may be low assertives because they fear open criticism, or they fear being embarrassed, or they feel someone saying no. They're trying to avoid conflict, and they may even not ask. They may sort of completely go without, because they're more likely to be inquisitive and seek collaboration, and if before they ask for anything, and if they don't get that collaboration, then they may not ask at all. So those people are known as asks, and it could be to do with bad previous experiences. That's why they're low assertive. You know, I'm not a psychologist, it could go further than that, but we need to recognize if someone's highly assertive or lowly assertive, and then we can deal with them in a different way. The second factor from Merrill was responsiveness, also known as sociability. So how we respond to people. And again, he said there were two ends of the scale: high responsiveness and low responsiveness. High responsive people give higher emotional responses. They show empathy. It may not be planned. It's just they have less control over their emotions and their reactions. They're very people orientated and less task orientated. We talked about that in emotional intelligence, and they're known commonly as emotes, so emotive people on the high response. You then got the low responsive people, less likely to show empathy, keep their emotions in check. They do a lot of thinking before they respond to things, and that thinking can slow down their reactions. As we said in emotional intelligence when we talked about your triggers, that thinking process can help you control that. But it also can leave you seeming uninterested, ponderous, very unsympathetic. So you need to be careful with that. And they're known as controls. So a little bit more detail than we originally started out with those two axes of assertiveness and responsiveness. But it still appears in this quadrant to sort of set out those four main areas. But he decided that if you use those axes, that it was a sliding sort of scale between, say, low assertive and high assertive, and low responsive and high responsive. You could end up with some sub-quadrants in each sort of sub-style, secondary style, whichever you want to call it, and they're on the screen now. So you can see, for example, analytic, expressive, because analytic borders onto expressive. So it's an interesting way to look at things, a little bit more complex, but what does it mean? Well, straightforward, really. It means we can make an assessment of our own behavioural style and the way we interact with others, and we can look at other people's and start to predict how they might behave, how they might react, identify the differences, particularly if we're building a team. We may use this information to sort of decide who we work with, maybe deciding that certain people are more likely to fit into certain roles because of their style or the way they react. They may feel more comfortable, or we may be adapting a style to make them feel more comfortable, deciding who we might delegate tasks to, who we might team up together. It's an interesting theory, and one that you can research a little bit further. So now let's take a look at transactional analysis. That's the study of transactions, of communication and relationships between people. A psychologist, Eric Berne, in the 1950s, developed the idea that we can switch between different emotional states, sometimes known as ego states or states of mind, while we're communicating or interacting with people. Now that might happen 2 or 3 times in a single conversation. It might be that we change our states for different roles or dealing with different people, or it may just be that it's between our daily life, like family life, and our work life. But the 3 states he identified are on the screen: parent, adult, and child, and therefore it's often referred to as the parent-adult-child model. So what did he say they were? Well, he outlined parent as being a reflection of those sort of authority figures such as the teacher, the manager, but he said it had 2 main functions, and the first was around actually being a parent and looking after siblings, and then the second, which is more related to the workplace, he talked about it for ensuring that things get done the way we want them done, and often we slip into it automatically and we don't realise that's how you do it, or do it like this, not like that, for example. The next state he talked about was adult, and he said this was hopefully the state where we deal with things professionally, everyday matters, sort of get on with things, but he also identified it as the regulator between our parent and child. That could be mediating it in ourselves between our parent and a child, and it could be in other people. And the child one, he said, was not actually child-ish, it was about being childlike. Childlike meaning that it's where we get our intuition, our inquisitiveness, our creativeness, our spontaneousness. But with all those things comes, and he associated with it, there was a lack of responsibility and an expectation to be looked after or protected, maybe not responsible for the outcomes or the consequences of what we were doing. So he used this model, he used these states, to build a model around it and show how we impact on relationships and interactions with others. So let's have a quick look at some typical sort of relationships. So in this visual here, we see a typical relationship at work, what we might class as a good working relationships with 2 people working together as adults. Of course, that might not always be perfect. There may be situations where we need intuition, creativity, spontaneity. That will come from the child person, our ego state within us. But that works fine. And then we see here a more usual working relationship with one person, the manager, acting as the parent, using a parental approach, and the second person usually willingly, sometimes less willingly, complying and becoming the child and responding, doing as they're told, doing as they are directed. And these work absolutely fine as long as both parties are happy with that ego state or that role that they're playing and that they're responding to. The problems occur when we get crossed reactions, as we can see in the visual now. For example, the manager attempts to retain an adult-to-adult relationship, but the person they're working with prefers to become a child and act like a child, and therefore we get an unstable relationship because he's looking for direction as a parent, but he's not getting it. Now, that can persist, and it will work, and it can carry on for a long time, but it can become stressful, tired, it can develop ill feeling, and it can be a difficult situation to work in. So, transactional analysis is a model that can help us identify issues and get on top of problems, and the sort of common ones are we get a situation where people adopt a state to try, an ego state, to try and make a point, so they're intentionally becoming something, and this causes stresses. So they might decide that I'm in charge, so I'm going to act like a parent all the time, or I don't agree with a person, so I'm going to become a parent so that I can win. We get people who don't recognize these states or accept them, so they react intentionally. So you treat me like a child, so I'm going to act like one, no responsibility. I'm just going to go off on my own, spontaneous, do what I'm going to sit there and wait to be directed, told what to do. And then finally, probably the worst is where people aren't aware of these states or stay in one because of the experience they've had previously. For example, they've been managed by a manager who's always treated them like a parent-child relationship, and when they're not in that situation, they don't know what to do. They just continue to respond like a child because they know nothing different. So transactional analysis can be interesting. We can use it to observe situations. Before they develop, we can identify things. We can try and make changes to improve team performance or team relationships. We can use it to develop our own relationships by recognizing our ego states and being more self-aware. and recognising how other people are responding to them. So lots of information out there. Do a bit of research on it. You can do questionnaires as well, which can guide you towards these things. But again, being aware of this as another tool in our developing of our self-awareness and our relationship with people is really useful. And briefly, just before we go to doing an activity, I just want to talk about working styles. This is where you're looking for patterns in the way you work, using everything we've covered really, identifying your strengths from your behaviours, what characteristics there might be and what might be limiting your effectiveness. As we've said, being self-aware is valuable, and knowing your own working style will help you identify any advantages, issues, and that can lead to you developing strategies, because that's all about developing strategies so you can be more productive. There are different ideas out there on working styles, and in the resources there are two questionnaires, both using different sort of approaches. One is based on the four main behaviour types that we talked, the people style grid sort of area, and then the other one is based on what is known as 5 common working styles, and they're coming up on the screen now. So we've got hurry up, please people, be perfect, try hard, and be strong. And there's some words associated with that there, but in the resources there's an article you can read, or you can do your own research about what these mean a little bit more when you're trying to identify your own working style, because they all have their strengths and weaknesses, and quite often the weaknesses come from the over impact of the strengths. So being too good at one thing means you're vulnerable to other things, and it's about making a balance. And the problem is when we may be aware of that, but the problem is when we become stressed or we're under pressure, we will normally revert to whatever drives us, whatever our main working style is, and we won't even realise we're doing it. Some people will say it's a natural instinct, others say it's something that we've built up from experiences we've had. Whatever it is, whatever it's formed from, we don't even realise we're doing it, and before we know it, we're reverting to a style that isn't necessarily the most productive for us. So first step to it is being aware. So in the activity, you'll be looking at doing a working styles questionnaire and trying to identify it, and it'll be useful for you because later on in your qualification you have to start analysing yourself and looking at where you can improve things. So let's have a look at what we want to do for the activity. So the activity to end this session is based in 2 parts. The first part is I want you to complete the activity around behavioural styles and look at the links and implications that could come in the workplace. That's a Word document, and then you can complete that and upload that, and again that'll be useful for you when we get to the end of unit assessment. And then secondly, I want you to complete the working style questionnaire. If you look in the resources, there are 2 choices, or you can research your own, or you can do more than one, because it's about you becoming aware of your own working style, and you're going to need to evaluate that later on and talk about what changes you can make. So the more you do, the better. Could give you different results. It'll be good for your own self-awareness and, like I say, evidence for later. So if you complete those and upload those as well before you move on to the final session for this unit.